Right. So this video is going to be the solutions to practice problems related to the basics of arrow pushing. And so for each of the following reactions, we have to identify the bonds that were formed and the ones broken. And then we have to draw arrows to illustrate electron flow. So for this first one, we can see that we start off with this OH in the reactants, and that in the products, we have this oxygen by itself. And so we can draw in those lone pairs on the oxygen. So we have 2 in the starting material and 3 in the products. And so altogether, we can see that that oxygen-hydrogen bond was broken. And the electrons from that bond ended up on the oxygen since it now has 3 lone pairs. Next, we can take a look at this nitrogen. So we can see that this nitrogen initially only had 1 hydrogen bonded to it, and now it has 2. And so we know that we formed a nitrogen-hydrogen bond. And so based off seeing the hydrogens being lost from the oxygen, we know that that hydrogen that was initially on the oxygen is the one that ends up on the nitrogen. And so to draw arrows to illustrate the electron flow, we want to start at the lone pairs. So to show the nitrogen-hydrogen bond that is formed, we would start with the lone pair in the nitrogen, because that's the lone pair being used to form that bond. And then we draw an arrow to the atom that those electrons formed a bond with. Next, we have to show that the oxygen-hydrogen bond was broken. So we would start at the lone pair in the bond, or not the lone pair, in the electrons in the bond, and show that those end up as an additional lone pair on the oxygen. So again, we're starting where the bond was and ending up as the lone pair. All right, we can do this next one. So here we have, we start off with 2 things and then we end up with 1 product. And so we can see that 1 bond that was broken is this carbon-oxygen bond right here. That's part of the double bond between the carbon and the oxygen. And so we break that double or like one of those bonds and end up with just 1. And then those electrons end up being on this as a lone pair on the oxygen. We can also see that we ended up forming a bond between this OH and the carbon atom right here. And I highlighted those in blue to help illustrate where all those atoms are. And so we form a carbon bond to that OH. And so to show a bond forming, we start at the lone pair from the oxygen and go to the atom that it forms a bond with. So that lone pair in the oxygen formed a bond with that blue carbon in the middle. And then the bond that broke is going to be that green one. So we're starting at the bond and then going to where those electrons end up, which is a lone pair on the oxygen. For this next one, we can see that we, similarly to the other one, we initially started off with a 2 products, ended up with 2 products where the bromine and the CN group swapped. And so the bond that was broken is this carbon-bromine bond. And the new bond that's formed is this carbon bond to the CN group. And then we can also fill in those lone pairs. So we know that bromine has 3. And then in the products, it would have 4 here because it has that negative charge. And then if we were to draw out that CN group, it would look something like this. And I'll draw it on in red here, where that carbon has a negative charge because it has a lone pair. And so this lone pair is what allows us to form a new bond. And so here we can draw a arrow from the lone pair to show this new bond forming. And so we're starting from the lone pair and going to the carbon where we formed a new bond. And then in the second step, to show the breaking of the carbon-bromine bond, we start from the carbon-bromine bond and draw an arrow to the bromine atom. All right. So this next one's a little bit tricky because here we can see that we start off with a neutral carbon that's shown in green on the left, and it ends up with a lone pair or a negative charge on the right. And then we also end up seeing that this OH gets converted to an H2O. And so at some point, this OH picked up an extra hydrogen. And so we formed a hydrogen bond with an OH for that blue water molecule that's part of the products. And now we have to figure out where that hydrogen came from. And so that hydrogen actually comes from this green carbon right here. So it can draw in those hydrogens. And so one of these hydrogens is one of the ones that ends up in the water molecule. And so when that carbon becomes deprotonated, or meaning that that hydrogen is removed, we end up with that negative charge on that carbon. And so the bond that was broken here is going to be that carbon hydrogen bond that is highlighted in green right here. And so to show the formation of the bond, we would start with the lone pair on the oxygen and draw an arrow to the atom that it forms a bond with. And so in this first arrow, right now we've illustrated the formation of H2O. And then we also want to show the breaking of the bond. So we start with the bond and then go to where those electrons end up, which is on that carbon atom in the middle. All right, so for this next one, we can see that we start off with one thing and we end up with two. And so the main difference is going to be that carbon bromine. And so we can see that that carbon bromine bond broke. And we didn't actually form any bonds here. We only just had that one bond break. And so to illustrate this breaking, we start at the bond and then draw the arrow to the atom where the electrons end up, which is on that bromine. So I'll draw in the lone pairs on the bromine to help illustrate that we start off with 3 and end up with 4 lone pairs. And so since we only have one bond breaking here, we can see that we only end up with this one arrow to illustrate that reaction.